Good evening, everybody. Good evening, John. How's everybody doing? Good? Good. All right. I'm fascinated by authors who write sequels. I am interested in the unfinished work that a sequel invites us to think about. All the Broken Places is a sequel of sorts to your wonderfully influential book, The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. What unfinished business did you feel like you had with the characters of your first novel? Of the first novel, not your first novel, but the first one.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out here tonight, this evening. It's a pleasure to be back in India, and thank you to Ambassador Kelly and the embassy for sponsoring this. I might say before I answer your question, I do have a family relationship to India because my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, is Indian from Delhi, and they got married in Delhi, and my two nieces are half Irish and half Indian. So it's nice to be here. I've published 20 books between the adult books and the young people's books, and I've never written a sequel before. This was the first time. And it was with me from very early on. I finished the first draft of Boy in the Striped Pyjamas on 30th of April, 2004. And I remember the date because it was my birthday. And the day I finished it, I thought to myself, at some point in my life, I would like to go back to Gretel, Bruno's sister, and explore her life. And for all those years between then and I guess around 2020, 2021, maybe, when I started writing All the Broken Places, I kept a file on my computer called Gretel's Story, which was my working title for the book. And I wanted to go back to her for several reasons. One was that I felt I had left her at the end of that book in this very dark place. You know what happens to Bruno and his father and his mother, but I've left a 12-year-old child traumatized. And I was interested in the idea that in that first book, in Striped Pyjamas, we were looking at the subject of the Holocaust from the most naive point of view possible, a 9-year-old who knows nothing about what's going on. Now, what would it be like to be the child of a commandant at a concentration camp, knowing what your father has done, being unable to get away from the fact that you love your father, and have gone through your entire life feeling this complex series of emotions of guilt, of shame, of complicity, of wondering, how much of this is my fault, how much isn't? I was just a kid. And I wanted to explore that. And I knew if I published it, I was published in 2022 back home, so the Gretel character is 91 years old. And the reason I decided, I thought originally I was going to wait many more years before writing this book. At one point I thought it could be my last book, when I'm in my 80s or 90s. Hopefully it won't be my last book, but I decided to publish it and write it now because I thought now it would be a contemporary story. So I've got a 9-year-old, I've got a 91-year-old, and I'm the guy writing it who's exactly halfway between the two. But in a way, I've got no problem with sequels. I love sequels, if it's a good sequel. But in a way, I prefer to think of this as a companion novel, because it's got a slightly different audience in mind. The first book was really written and published for younger readers. It spread out wider, thankfully. But I feel this is a much more adult, complex piece of fiction.
Well, this is in part, there are lots of questions I have coming out of your answer, but the first one would be, you describe The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas as a fable. Yeah. And this is much more of a realist novel. How were you thinking about making or carrying the story over from the genre of the fable to the genre of the realist novel and all of the responsibilities for representing an adult's life that come with that move?
Well, I thought it was an interesting idea that, if it is a sequel, I couldn't think of many sequels I couldn't think of many sequels where the original book was originally published for young people and that the sequel as such was published for adults. I thought it was quite an interesting idea, and it would mean that I had to write it in a very different style. I'm a very different person than I was. I was 33 when I wrote Striped Pyjamas. I was 50 when I wrote All the Broken Places. So a much more experienced writer, also much more experienced in life, and hopefully a better writer. I do think sometimes that almost naivety about young people's literature when I wrote Striped Pyjamas was to the benefit of the book, because there are so-called rules of children's literature that most writers disobey those kind of things, but things that you perhaps, if you set out knowing them, you would stop yourself from doing, such as the ending and things like that. Whereas you have a lot more freedom, I think, in a way, writing the realist novel. I knew I couldn't go back to that sort of fable-like, fairy tale-like tone. It would seem forced now, whereas when I wrote it originally, it seemed very natural to me. It was exactly who I was. It was the kind of story I wanted to tell, but I just couldn't tell it in the same way now.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. In the American context, at least, I have two children. One is 6 and one is 8. And it strikes me that in the American context, children's literature is probably the most presentist. It's the most responsive to current political and social concerns. So when I go to my children's classrooms, the kinds of books that I see are very, very attuned to contemporary conversations about social justice, for instance. And it strikes me that adult novels don't have to be presentist in the same way that a lot of children's literature is. When we leave Gretel at the end of The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, she's weeping over the loss of her brother. And it's actually quite a surprising moment, because up to that point, she's not an especially sympathetic character. And she's quite rebarbative, and their relationship is one of kind of normal sibling antagonism, but there is a kind of cruelty in it that you see because of the context that they're in. How did you think about taking her from that place of weeping, of grieving her brother's loss, and of showing the kind of unfinished process of that grieving? What did you want to show in that process?
Well, I mentioned about keeping that file on the computer for all those years of who she is. And my idea of who she was going to turn out to be in later life kept changing through those years. At one point, I was sure that the novel would end up taking place in New York. I thought she would be one of those kind of like a crazy person on the street who starts screaming at people. I thought she was going to be like that. But she's not. She lives in London. She's very quiet. She's very introverted. She doesn't want to know people. She doesn't want any fuss in life. She's afraid of being confronted by the past, for the most part. She's lived a very secluded existence because she has been traumatized by the experiences that she went through as a child. Now, not to say she's the victim. She's not the victim. We know who the victims are, but it is her story. So, and I don't plot my novels in advance. I tend to start and then see where it will take me. But once I started with her, once I got her tone right in the first chapter, I just felt she needs to be an observer of things. Quiet, sharp, smart, truthful, and perhaps looking for something to happen in her life at 91, for something to happen where she might gain some moments of redemption for not just her past, but her family's past. And she's not sure if that moment is ever going to come, but because this is a novel, then, that moment does come, and she can make a decision about how she is going to react to that, how she's going to respond to it. And I felt I captured her right, and the funny thing is it's a dark novel, but sometimes they're not unpleasant to write. When I was writing the first draft, I was excited to come down every day and start writing it, mostly because I felt the story was going the right way, but I also felt, I had spent so much of my life talking about that family and the characters and the historical episode that I was letting this story build in front of me, and I felt I knew who Gretel was, and I felt the same way with Bruno and with the parents. They've been part of me for a long time, so I was glad to get her voice back.
Yeah, well, and the novel, I think, does an excellent job going back and forth between the present of Gretel's narration and the past, recollecting how it was that she and her mother fled to Paris and what happened to them afterwards. How did you think about going back and forth between past and present? Was that always the intention to have those kind of twinned storylines, or did that develop as you realized you needed a different way to fill out?
gonna have to start dancing there.
Go, you go first. No, did that develop as you realized you needed a different way to fill out the backstory?
Yeah, no, I knew that from the start. And it's a structure I've used in a few novels. I like dual timelines. I've written a few that do use that kind of conceit. What I had to decide was, I knew that the one through line all the way through it would be now, her life in London as a 91-year-old. But what were going to be the scenes, the sections from the past? So I chose 3. I really liked the idea of going immediately to Paris after the war, because then we're effectively picking up from just after the end of the events of Striped Pyjamas. And she's a couple of years older, she's 15, and the reality of what happened in the war is starting to dawn on all of Europe. You know, it was really like 46, 47, 48 even, when the realities of the Holocaust were really being reported and people were starting to understand the horror of it all. So for her, and for her mother, who's in those scenes, I wanted them to experience that gradual understanding that the world was aware of what her father had been part of. Also, I was always interested in the idea of what, like Paris after the war. You know, French people had to come to terms with the Vichy government, with the capitulation, with the with dealing with there was you've seen those pictures of women who were had their heads brutally shaved and things for having relationships with German officers during the war. So I felt that was a good place to be. Then Australia in the 50s. I used Australia because I know Australia very well. It's a place I've been many times, but it's also the furthest you can go away from Europe without coming home again. And I thought for Gretel, she would go there thinking, I can leave my past behind if I go this far. But of course, she can't, because the past invades on her immediately, almost there. And she realizes this is, it's a small planet actually, and that this is a story that has affected people all over the world, and she's not going to be able to outrun her past. And then the third part, the 50s in London, when she comes back, I wanted us to see who she was when she begins that life in London that we now see her at a later age. So structurally, it just seemed to work to me. One thing going through, then Paris, Australia, London.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's an interesting way. You used the word redemption earlier, yeah, which to me always has a kind of religious, quasi-religious connotation to it. But I do think that there are some transgressions for which people can never be redeemed. All you can do is look the thing that you have done in the eye and live with it. Was this really an arc of redemption for you, or was it more an arc of recognition? Because the novel begins very interestingly by quoting Voltaire, yeah, right, and saying, talking about what it means to try to pretend that the bad things that you have done are somehow justified, or simply to forget about the bad things that you have done. So is it redemption or is it recognition? And is recognition perhaps enough? Do we need redemption too?
I think that's a good way to put it, actually. One of the questions for the reader is how responsible is Gretel for any of this? She was just a child. But there are sections of the book where we realize there are things that she could have done that she didn't do. No, there is probably no redemption for her, and she's not always the most attractive of characters. She's spiky, she's embittered, she can be kind, but it takes a little bit of effort to get that kindness out. So you're probably right that it's not so much redemption. At the same time, I'm not sure it's entirely recognition, because I think she, pretty much from the 50s part on, she has that recognition. Mm-hmm. She is aware of it, and she's trying to kind of squash it down all the time, not think about it. She can't even refer to her brother by his name. She doesn't want to. She cannot live in the past anymore, and it's overwhelming to her. And I don't even, I mentioned that maybe she's looking for a moment she can do something to atone for something. Mm-hmm. She might not even be fully conscious that she's looking for that, but when that opportunity presents itself, right, she seizes it. If it wasn't for that opportunity, I think she would probably have just gone to her grave eventually, and mm-hmm, mm-hmm, without changing. Mm-hmm. But I do think there is a part of her wants to do something good, mm-hmm, in life, wants to feel that if she can save one person, she, it can represent something bigger.
Yeah, a sort of question that I'm going to ask a question that I don't really believe in the premises of,
Okay.
but, how did you think about writing a woman? Does that seem any different to you than writing from the point of view of a child? Because children, I think, are often as alien to adults, or the consciousness of a child can be as alien to an adult as the consciousness of one person is to another, across sex, gender, race, whatever. So were there any particular things you were thinking of when you were thinking, I want to write a female character, female narrator, who is spiky and unlikable and has these moments of kindness, also has moments of great deadpan,
Yeah.
I think. What were the considerations that went into creating that voice for you?
Well, I'd written a novel before, which was narrated by a woman. It's not, and my most recent one that's just come out at home is narrated by a woman. I don't find that a difficult thing to do, because I don't have a huge backlist of books which are very autobiographical. Only 2 of my novels, I think, are set in Ireland, and most of my books have been set around the world, and a lot of them are historical. So I don't find it very different to sort of imagine what it's like to be a woman than I do to be a First World War soldier or a child. At least with Bruno in Striped Pyjamas, I was a 9-year-old boy once, so I could imagine, I could try to put myself back to being a 9-year-old and what those feelings were like. I know some women. And, I don't think men and women are really that different when it comes to narrative voices in a novel. And I think more male writers should write from their perspective. I think more female writers should write from a man's perspective. So I didn't struggle with that. It's still about just trying to finding the tone in which it's going to be narrated, the character, and creating Gretel in that way was no different than, Cyril in Heart's Invisible Furies, or Morrison in Ladder to the Sky, or Tristan in The Absolutist. It's me trying to fully form some kind of character who is entirely made up in my head and make them sound authentic all the way through.
The ambassador mentioned the incredible pedagogical reach of The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, that it's sort of regularly taught in middle schools and in high schools. And fables have that kind of function, don't they? It's easy to teach a fable, or it's easy to offer people a fable and say, let's talk about the lessons that we can take away from it. You can't really do that with a novel, or the way you do that with a novel has to be significantly different than the way you might do it with a fable. So can you talk a little bit about whether having the first book, having The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas be taught so widely, whether that made you think about the potential teacherly or pedagogical aspects of all the broken places?
The strange thing about the fact that it's used in so many schools is that was never part of it was never the intention. I was sitting down writing a novel. I thought that this was going to be a novel for kids that would, maybe some kids would come to. I didn't expect almost 20 years later to be still talking about it. And one of the criticisms of the book in more recent years is the fact that it's used in schools, which you must remember was never, I didn't ask anybody to teach it in schools. When I was growing up in Dublin, we didn't learn about the Holocaust at all. My first introduction to it was reading Night by Elie Wiesel when I was 15 from the library. And I've gone into, I would say, probably 1,000 schools around the world in the last 20 years, most recently in Kolkata here. And I always say to the kids in the schools, look, this is a novel. This is not exactly how the events of the Holocaust were. I've changed things to tell a story. And all I wanted kids to get out of it was that they would care enough about Bruno and Shmuel, the 2 boys at the heart of the story, that they might then be inspired to go on and read Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi or Anne Frank or non-fiction, all the much, much better books. So I've been criticized at times for writing a book that is inaccurate, so to speak. But you see, I don't think novels can be inaccurate. There's no, it's all made up. Bruno never existed. Shmuel never existed. It's all made up in my head. So I don't see how that can be inaccuracies in a novel. But to come back to your question, did I think about that then? I think subconsciously there was a part of me that wanted to respond to those criticisms a little bit. And I think All the Broken Places is a better book, as it should be because I'm an older writer. And as we mentioned earlier, writing it in a different tone. But I was still having to follow the rules of my first book in terms of what had happened in that story. I couldn't change that story. So anybody coming to read this, if they were using it in a school or university or any sort of educational platform about learning about the Holocaust, to me, that's up to the teachers then and the students to recognize this is a work of fiction. And what is it telling us as a work of fiction? That's not my responsibility. That's the people who decide this is what we're going to be studying in the classroom. I think it's theirs.
Why do you think that the burden for a novel to be factually accurate is higher when that novel represents something like the Holocaust? Because I do think that your book, more than others that represent other kinds of historical atrocities, invites that or has solicited that criticism. Why do you think that is? I mean, it's interesting, right? Because not all novels that represent historical atrocities are held to that same standard of accuracy. But for some reason, this one has come under a particularly intense fire for that. And I find it interesting and just inconsistent generally. So.
Well, it didn't come under that intense fire for very many years.
Yeah.
It really only started around 2020, which I don't think it's a coincidence that a year before I had been, pilloried for writing a novel for young readers about a transgender character, and social media, being the delightful playground, had really just gone to town on me. Yeah. And it was a year after that suddenly a book that had been beloved for about 14 years suddenly became a book that was, loathed suddenly. Right. It seems to have turned around again. I mean, I can't control any of that, but I think the two things were related in some way. I think there was a takedown wanting to happen. My feeling, and I've listened to the criticisms and I've heard them and I've thought about them, and I just don't agree with them. And there is the part of me that says, look, for almost 20 years, an entire generation of kids have grown up reading this book, which has at least told them something about the Holocaust and at least got them interested in it. And isn't that something in itself? Isn't that something to be proud of? It's something I'm proud of. Yeah. And I refuse to not be.
I want to go back to All the Broken Places because it occurs to me that, as you just talked about, one of the threads in the book is Gretel's backstory, but of course the thread that's running through the present too is about the family that moves into the apartment below the apartment that she lives in, and how there is a little boy there. It's a mother and a father and a little boy, and it becomes clear to Gretel quite quickly that there is some serious domestic abuse going on in that apartment, and she feels in a way responsible for the child who is suffering from that domestic abuse. And it strikes me that one of the other differences, of course, between The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas and All the Broken Places is that on the one hand, you have the violence of the state and the way that the German nation is systematically killing people. And on the other hand, you have the intimacy of domestic violence. How do you think about writing these different kinds of violence, which are different, but are, I think, can be traumatizing in equal, if still distinct, ways?
I thought, when I was thinking about this family who were moving into the flat underneath Gretel, I thought a long time about who they were going to be and how I was going to build them. And then it dawned on me that they have to be effectively Gretel's old family. Right. So we have a father who is committing acts of violence. We have a mother who is sort of out of it all the time and letting these things continue. We have a little boy who is a 9-year-old innocent child who is ultimately being one of the victims of this violence. And the only thing missing in that downstairs family is Gretel herself from the first book. So when she comes down that staircase and she starts to understand that something is going on there, she's reinserting herself into this family square and reimagining, in a way, the life that she had before, and saying, I can't let this happen again. So, I didn't want to make it, too cliched in some way, but I did draw on the previous family and try to just restructure them in a 2020 setting.
I don't want to give away any spoilers for the book, but one of the ways that she makes things right is with a kind of shocking act of violence herself.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you think about the relationship between violence and redemption, or violence and recognition, because it's interesting that she inserts herself into that family's life in order to commit a shocking act, to put an end to the shocking acts that she has been witnessing.
Well, I remember when I was writing Striped Pyjamas, and when I was rewriting it particularly, that one of the thoughts I had was to try to represent the most violent time that had happened probably in human history, and to have no violence on the page at all. So in that book, every time something awful happens, like when Lieutenant Kotler kills Pavel the waiter, Bruno can't put it into words. So it's like turning the camera away in a movie. And I always found that was a scarier way to do it. That like the reader.
What happened next was unpleasant and predictable, right? That's
and the reader has to, especially the young reader, has to think for themselves of what it would be. By the same token, I started this novel knowing I was going to end it on a moment of violence, and that sometimes maybe a violent act has to be committed in order to set the world back to rights. So and I felt Gretel was the person who was going to have to commit that violent act, and I was always kind of working my way forward in time to that moment, as opposed to Striped Pyjamas, where I only thought up the ending when I was about 3/4 of the way through, and then I realized where the novel was going to end, and it's my most famous ending, obviously.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, what you're talking about is the way that trauma is always reproducing itself. That we're always, if we've been traumatized, or if we've done something to traumatize someone else, we end up always returning to that scene. We keep replaying it over and over and over again. And there's something interesting about the way the logic of trauma works with the logic of the sequel. That the sequel replays the trauma of the original, but in a different key. And as I was thinking about the ending of this, I was wondering, is this a trilogy? Is the next book about Henry, the little boy in that family, and the way that the violence of the ending begets the violence of a beginning for him? Or are you done with this story and these characters?
I am for now. Yeah. If there ever will be a third one, it wouldn't be about Henry. The one last character left standing from Striped Pyjamas at the end of All the Broken Places really is Lieutenant Kotler, who escapes again, and I don't know what happens to him after. He reappears in All the Broken Places in a very crucial scene, and I think for me the best scene in the book. He reappears, and he's the last man standing, because he's the true believer as well. He is, and he's, you see, what was interesting about writing him as well in the second book is that he's just the worst human being ever. I mean, he's morally repugnant. And yet he is the one who sits down with Gretel and says, and challenges her, and says, be honest with yourself. Don't you wish we had won? Here you are, working in a shop in Sydney. You've no money. You could have been the most eligible young woman in Germany. You could have still been rich. Had a wonderful life. Be honest with yourself. Don't you wish we had won? And she has to challenge herself on that, because there is that part of her that does wish that. She doesn't want to wish it, but she does. So I thought, so if I ever did go back, it would be in another 20 years' time, but it would be Kotler I would go back to. And in the same way I have a little file called Kotler's Story that, maybe one day I'll finish it with him, but that would be the last one, if I ever do.
Well, it's interesting because in The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, Bruno refers to his sister as the hopeless case, and the lieutenant seems like the truly hopeless case, and perhaps a completely hopeless case for a novelist. I mean, you can imagine what the risks would be of trying to create an interior life for
trying to make somebody sympathetic, because the reader still has to feel some relationship to him. And the only thing I've left myself with him in terms of character, in a way, is that in the first book we do learn that his father is a university professor who has fled Germany for Switzerland, and so is one of those few voices at the time who were willing, like Bruno's grandmother, were willing to stand up and be heard and be counted at great potential personal cost to themselves. So that's the only kind of like backstory I have on him. But at least it's a bit of a backstory that could eventually lead me to something. But like, you do have to feel some, you have to care about a character, even like if it's Hannibal Lecter, you know, you still kind of have to care in some way to know why are you like this, what's happened to you, and that's in some ways one of the jobs of fiction. It's you know, you don't want to just present, you know, the most beautiful saintly figures all the time. You know, evil is there, evil is in the world, and you know, I've written a lot about a different kind of evil. I've written a lot about paedophilia, and in Ireland about the experiences of growing up, in my experience of growing up, and the role of the church back there, and the things that many of us went through in the school system then. And anytime I've written about it, like in A History of Loneliness, I haven't written from the point of view of a priest committing the acts. I've written from the point of view of someone who doesn't, but who is aware it's going on and does nothing about it, which I always think is the really fascinating thing. You know, how can you know about these things and do nothing to stop it? Right. You know, at least, I mean, if you're doing something like that, there's probably something just wrong with you in your head. But if you know that something is going on and you do nothing, to me, that's a more interesting character to write about.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you think explains that fascination you have with complicity? I mean, I'm thinking about how in most Holocaust literature, the figure of complicity is the capo, the Jewish prisoner who helped the Nazis surveil and punish the other Jewish prisoners. Where do you think your fascination with complicity as opposed to outright transgression comes from?
It's there in quite a lot of my novels. It's really the running theme. And it comes from that. It comes from the fact of the time and place that I grew up in. And unfortunately, I was one of those victims of those crimes and ended up, you know, in taking a court case, and like many of my friends did. Several of my former teachers from those years are in jail. But what I always say about those times is that very, very small minority of people were committing those acts, but a wide majority knew that they were going on. And Ireland in those days, you know, where, you know, if a parent went to the bishop and said, this has happened, this priest has done this to my child, rather than going to the police, the bishop would just move the priest to a different parish. And years later, when these things were all brought out, and all the court cases happened and so on, you know, there were elderly bishops and archbishops who genuinely said, but I moved the priest. Right. You know, I didn't leave him in the same parish with little John or little Jane. And he's like, yeah, you moved him to a different place where there's another little John and little Jane. You know, where is your head? What is wrong with you? Yeah. So it comes from that, of kind of growing up and, you know, getting to a place in my life in my 20s where I was so messed up by what had happened to me, and so enraged and so incapable of forming relationships myself because of that I didn't feel that anger towards the perpetrators. I felt it towards the entire society who allowed it to happen and didn't, you know, and it took so long. It took people like Mary Robinson, it took people like Sinead O'Connor, you know, and it took all of those men and women who suffered at the hands of these criminals to actually stand up and have their voices heard and empower other people like me to do the same. It took them to do it.
It's so interesting to me that you consistently write from the point of view of the kind of person toward whom you feel the most angry. And is that a kind of ethical test to try to see if you can create a sympathetic space or a space of sympathy for the type of person toward whom you feel rage?
Maybe it is, you know, maybe it's my way of working these things out in my head, my way of understanding them. But I know, like, for example, A History of Loneliness, which was my first novel on this subject, and was from the point of view of a priest. I published that in 2014. I could not, and I was, you know, what was I, my early 40s then. I could not have written that in my early 30s because it would have been so full of rage that it would have been a bad novel. You know, because you have to think in terms of being a writer as well. You're writing a novel. You're not writing a screed. You know, you're not writing something that's just pounding away at the reader like into the ground. You have to think of it as a piece of, you know, work of risk of sounding pretentious. So, you know, an artistic project as well. So you want the reader to feel that these are very ambiguous characters in a way. That how do you feel at the end of it? Is this priest guilty or innocent? Is Gretel guilty or innocent? Am I guilty or innocent of, you know, any complicity or enabling I've done in my life as a reader or a writer? You know, that's what I'm aiming for. And you know, they do say that, you know, a lot of writers, you keep writing the same book over and over, you know, trying to figure out the answers to those questions, and maybe that's just the journey that I'm on in my life.
Yeah, well, and maybe innocence and guilt aren't the right categories.
There's
for
a whole
about this.
spectrum,
Yeah.
I think, in between the two.
Yeah. I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. Can we get hands raised high, please? Yes, over here first. Oh, okay, over there. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my question was, as you mentioned, your books received some criticism. So how do you manage that and keep your writing true to yourself under this pressure?
Sorry, how do I manage?
How do you manage that criticism and still keep your writing true to yourself under all that pressure?
Honestly, I think a writer always knows the value of their own work. You know, every time I publish a book, every time I'm sure you feel, you know, that you know whether you've achieved artistically what you set out to achieve. And it doesn't take somebody to tell you it's a masterpiece or a travesty. You know yourself whether you've achieved it. And you can't always. You know, I've published 20-something books, and if I lined them all up, I could tell you which ones I thought I've knocked it out of the park on, and which ones I've done my very best but didn't achieve what I hoped to achieve. And I think over the course of a lifetime, that's okay. You know, you do your best. I try not to read too many reviews. You know, they do kind of seep in because of the culture, but I just don't really let it get to me that much. I think if it's very personal, and you know, for a few years there, I had a lot of very personal attacks through the Jessica years and through all the broken places as well. And it seemed that it wasn't about the books; it was about me, and about sort of trying to destroy a person. And that was the nature of social media then. I think it's changing. I think people aren't that interested in that kind of thing so much these days, thankfully. But you just have to, you know, if you're going to be a writer, if you're going to have a life that is public in some way, and that your job is going to be reviewed in the papers, and you know, if you get a bad review, you can rely that your best friend's going to ring you up and say, "Hey, did you see that?" You know, so you just have to toughen up.
Question over here.
Did you do any research in terms of the psychological profiles of people from that era, children from that era who grew up and who would have been in reality the same age as Bruno's sister, to build up her character as an older woman?
I did. I read as widely as I could on the subject. I had also met, over my years of traveling with Striped Pyjamas, I had, the good fortune, well, sorry, I don't mean it this way, but I mean that my generation of writers is really the last generation who's had the opportunity to meet Holocaust survivors, because obviously, you know, time moves on and the numbers are dwindling. And over my travels over the years, I've had the good fortune to meet quite a few survivors, and even grandchildren or children of people who worked in camps and so on, and hear their stories one-on-one. And that's, you know, been enormously affecting to me over the years. And I remember there was this wonderful documentary I saw on the BBC a few years back, where they brought the descendants of victims of Auschwitz to Auschwitz with the descendants of the guards. And they met in like a big room. And it was incredibly powerful, because the descendants of the guards were the ones who were, they were just breaking down. And the descendants of the victims were comforting them. And I never forgot watching that and thinking, what a lesson in humanity, that actually the victims here are the ones who are throwing their arms around. I mean, none of them had done it, their descendants, but they were throwing their arms around these people who've had to deal with what Gretel has had to deal with. And I have German friends, and I spoke to them in the run-up to writing this book, sort of, what is it like knowing that your grandfather or whatever, obviously would have had to have played some role in the war. And, they were interesting stories to hear. And it fed back into my thing of, well, you can't be held responsible for it, but does it weigh on you, And so I did as much as I could possibly do, I think.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so in 5th grade, we actually read Boyne, the Striped Pyjamas at school as part of, learning about the Holocaust and everything. We also watched the movie. And I have to say, one moment that really stuck with me was, you mentioned it. It was when Pavel, he drops the bottle of wine and Kotler beats him up for that. And, before that moment, I always understood violence as a result of obedience to authority or listening to an older figure. But when I realized that violence could just be sadistic, or people could be sadistic just for the sake of being sadistic. And when it comes to power play between, a person in power and someone who isn't, I had a question in my mind, which was, do you think that certain people, like Kotler, or like in your recent book, The Abusive Father, do you think they could be considered bad people? Or do you think the whole, is this person good or bad? Do you think it's that dichotomous question is reductive in a sense?
Well, I think people grow immune to violence at times. One of the things about that scene in Striped Pyjamas is that, with the exception of Bruno and Gretel, actually, everybody else around that table just keeps eating. They're living this day-to-day life where there is so much going on. If somebody walked in here now and sort of tripped and fell, everybody would go to help them. But in that story, everybody just keeps eating their dinner. They become completely immune to it. And we do that, in All the Broken Places, the violence that's taking place downstairs. Sometimes we are too frightened to involve ourselves in things that are going on, and we kind of have to decide for ourselves, don't we? If we're going to lend our voices to, whether it's a political campaign, whether it's a social justice campaign, what do we want to? Do we have the courage to link ourselves to this, knowing that there might be blowback from something, knowing it could be problematic for one's career, especially in the times that we live in? Or do we feel we have to, because we can't live with ourselves if not? And you can't always. I'm not saying I always would, but there are times where you do need to speak up. And I think in All the Broken Places, that's what Gretel feels. It's a young man there. So.
Hello.
Hello.
So you told that Gretel was left after the ending of The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, but I have a question about what happened to Carl, Daniel, and Martin after Bruno's death.
Okay. So I have been talking about this book for nearly 20 years and probably answered every question I could, and no one has ever asked me that. Never, not once. So, well done. So for those who don't know who he's referring to, it's in the opening chapter of the book where Bruno has his 3 best friends for life, and he doesn't want to leave them behind, and then gradually he forgets them as time goes on, and Shmuel becomes his new friend. Honestly, I don't know. I've never given them any thought. I just don't know what had happened. What do you think might have happened to them? Since you've thought, yeah, you must have thought maybe. So what do you think?
I think what happened was they probably got to know about it a year and a half later, after Bruno's mother returned to Berlin. So they must have come wondering what happened to Bruno. They must have come wondering, is he going to come back to school and be casual friends like they were before? So I have not given much thought to it either.
Well, when I write the book, you get 50% of the royalties for that. So that's a great question.
I think we have time for one more question, and you have to top his.
Somebody at the
You have
back?
to top his. Let's get someone in the back, please. Yeah.
One question is, in the Striped Pyjama, reading it, I've read it a long time ago, but one of the key things that stuck with me were the play of friendship and relationships, transcending borders or fences or whatever that is. Of course, it goes wrong in the book, but is that something that's also a key element in the sequel, or is it more a history of loneliness and a summary of collective guilt, or touching more on these topics than on friendship and relationships?
Yeah, it's very much there in the first, not so much in the second. And actually, it's interesting you say that because, a phrase that I've always hated is the phrase a Holocaust novel. And when I think of Striped Pyjamas, I think it very simply, it's a novel about friendship. About two little kids who just want to be kids and are just friends and don't have all of the things that are, they don't have all the prejudices that are going on Bruno's side, and they don't want all the pain that's going on Shmuel's side. So it's very much about that. But no, All the Broken Places isn't really about that, because even though a friendship builds between Gretel and Henry, they're 82 years apart in age, and it's a different kind of relationship. So.
Well, John, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for those wonderful questions. Have a good night, everybody.